Hi everyone, my name's Sammy. I am a tutor with Greenhouse Learning. I specialise in maths and science at the secondary level. I put together this workshop on assessing and planning. This is to assist all of our tutors with the assessment stage of their tutoring, getting an idea of the students' level and how they're doing in relation to a syllabus, and then planning a scheme of work in relation to those assessments. This is going to have a bit of a maths and science focus at secondary level, particularly GCSE maths. However, it should be applicable to other subjects and levels as well. I would recommend, however, that you switch to either the essay-based assessment and planning workshop or the primary level assess and planning workshop, which may be more suited to you if those are your subjects or age groups. As for the structure of this presentation, I'm going to start by talking about the assessment stage, specifically some tips and tricks around assessing your students and some really important things in there. We're going to do a brief example of that as well with a fictional student profile. We'll then go on to the planning stage, talking about how to plan a scheme of work based on the assessments that we've conducted, again with an example to follow. And then the end of this assessment, what we'll actually do is we'll give you a short piece of homework. This will be a task for you to complete in your own time that will allow you to look at a fictional report of assessments and student notes and create your own plan for what you would do to teach that particular student. I really hope this is useful. If you have any questions at all, do contact us at office@greenhouselearning.co.uk. But let's get going. So we're going to start with the assessment stage, as I mentioned. Here's just a few general tips that I wanted to start with. We'll talk about all of them in more detail. Initial assessment, it's essential. Make sure there's an assessment at the start of your tutoring engagements. Short, regular assessments, I will talk a bit more about the importance of that. One assessment is not enough in a tutoring engagement. Accessing previous assessments, for example, the assessments that your students may have already completed in school. Not just about being correct answers, there's other things that need to be assessed as well that we'll get onto, for example, method. We've got mix up your methods. An assessment does not have to be an exam paper. We'll talk about that more. And tracking and recording all assessments. I'll give you some tips around that as well. So a couple of things to mention first, things to think about before you begin trying to assess a student. What's the exam board? Is it AQA, Edexcel? And if you've got the exam board, can you access the full syllabus, print it off or download a PDF of it? Have any weak areas already been highlighted or identified? Often when you're applying for a role with Greenhouse Learning, it will say in the student description, for example, student A particularly struggles with algebra and trigonometry. Look out for any weak areas that have already been highlighted. And finally, what school does the student attend? This is particularly relevant for Key Stage 3, as we don't yet have a GCSE exam board. A lot of schools publish their curriculum on their own website, always worth checking it out by logging onto the school's website and having a look at their curriculum for the particular year group. Anyway, first we'll start with the initial assessment. I've got some do's and don'ts here. I've got don't try to cover the whole syllabus. With your first assessment, if you try and cover the entirety of the GCSE math syllabus, you will end up covering 1, 2, even 3 hours of assessment time. You may have to give them a full exam paper. It's not the most efficient way to do this. It would be much more valuable to assess particular areas of the syllabus, as mentioned there, in a bit more detail. One question on a topic is not a good indication of how well a student understands that topic. Secondly, we've got don't give the student an assessment in complete silence. Don't just sit opposite your student while they complete an assessment in full. If you're engaging with the student and using conversation as an assessment tool, you can build up some ideas around their confidence, their feelings towards the particular subject. I just think it's a much more interactive way, especially because it's likely to be your first or second ever session with the student. Presenting them with an exam paper and sitting in silence is not a particularly valuable use of your time. And finally, I've got don't use content that's too difficult and will knock the student's confidence. This does vary between students, but a lot of students are coming to us for maths and science tutoring or tutoring in general because they're not very confident in that subject. throwing them in at the deep end is not going to build that confidence up anymore. I'd really encourage you to use content which starts below their level and builds up to their level. See how well they understand very basic maths problems, and then add layers to it, making sure that you can really track whether they're hitting those 5, 6, 7s, whatever grade they're aiming for. Now, that's a little bit of information about the initial assessment. I'm now going to move on to assessments being about more than just right answers. So I mentioned there are other things that could be assessed during the assessment stage of the tutoring. And in particular, I've highlighted 3, which I'm always looking out for with my own students. Those are understanding, confidence, and method. Understanding is fairly self-explanatory. Does the student understand the topic that you're working on? Have they demonstrated a sufficient knowledge in line with the curriculum? Confidence is definitely a big one. Does the student believe in themselves? Do they feel able to answer those kind of questions, or are they very hesitant or reluctant and looking to you for guidance? And finally, method or exam technique, looking specifically at what they write. Are they going to be getting those method marks? Is there a flaw in the way they've learned a particular technique? I've thrown in a couple of extra ones there. Speed is particularly important in exams. Obviously, there's a finite amount of time to sit an exam in, so we need our students to be completing questions at a sufficient speed. And attention to detail. Are they reading the question thoroughly? Are they annotating the question? Are they making sure that they get their units right? These are all ideas around what you can assess on, but I think it's really important to stress that just because a student gets a correct answer doesn't mean that they're at the level they should be at for a particular subject. There is a lot more to assess than just whether or not they got the correct answer. Now, moving on, we're going to go on to the frequency of assessments. I've put here that there should be frequent short assessments. Now, aside from that initial assessment, which could be a little bit longer, it's so important that you're continuously assessing your students' level. One, you need to be able to track their progress. You need to see how they're doing and if they're making progress in your lessons. And 2, there's an accountability measurement. Are you able to tell the parent how they're doing? A parent may come to you and say, how have they got on over the last few weeks? If you've not completed any form of assessment or homework task in that month, you have nothing to feed back to the parent. I would really encourage, following on to this second point, that each time you cover a topic, you create some form of assessment, whether that be finish the lesson with 3 questions on the topic that they have to do without any of your help, or even set a homework task. For example, I often bring worksheets to my sessions and we'll highlight 3 or 4 questions for the student not to complete during the lesson. And then at the end of the session, I will tell them to complete those questions before our following lesson. Additionally, assessments shouldn't always be immediately after you've covered a topic. Let's say I cover the topic of trigonometry and I do a short assessment and I'm happy with how my student does. Within the next 2 to 4 weeks following that, it would be a great time to just surprise them with a couple of mini questions. It's still an assessment. Give them a couple of quick fire questions at the start of a lesson. Say, hey, we did this 3 weeks ago. Do you remember how to do this? But regularity is very, very important here, especially if you're setting them assessments or small questions to do when you're not present, because we need to emulate those exam conditions as much as possible. Let's move on. Next, we've got alternative methods of assessment. I've touched on these already, but here's a few suggestions for how you can assess a student's level. We'll start with the basic one, exam papers and exam questions. Some of my favorite resources for these are PMT, Physics and Maths Tutor, particularly good for the GCSE level. Save My Exams is also very good, and I'm sure you'll have some of your own resources that you can use. Games, I like to use a good variety of games with some of my students, especially those who don't have a great attention span. Using Kahoot or Blookit or Quizlet, they're all sort of similar software. You can input your own questions, you can download packs of questions. Board games, I've brought Snakes and Ladders to my students' houses before, and you roll the dice, and before you're allowed to move the number of squares that are on the dice, you have to get a question correct. Battleships, a similar concept. Play a game of battleships, but each time they want to take a shot at you, they have to get a question correct. All of this points at having a good bank of questions available from some of those websites I've mentioned before, and inputting them into games that your student already enjoys. I've written here quick fire questions and a traffic light system. Something I often do as a mini assessment is I put together what I call a traffic light system of each topic. Again, taking trigonometry, my red level maybe, or my level 1, I suppose, I call it my red level, is my basic. This may be a question that has a diagram of a right angle triangle that has all of the missing values and just says calculate this missing value. Then we'll have a second tier question, our amber question, moving up to our green question. These will be sort of staggered in difficulty, and often the top most difficult question will be a bit more exam based. It could be a 3D trigonometry question, could be a question that doesn't explicitly say they need to use trigonometry, but it shows shapes and angles and that you're measuring the height or the incline of a ladder on a wall, something a little more exam based and a little tougher. If a student can get all 3 of these questions right, it shows that they've got that full coverage, they know exactly what they're doing on the topic. Finally, I put teach the teacher. Often what I'll encourage my students to do is do a short presentation to me or put together a small talk on a particular topic. We'll stick with trigonometry to be consistent. I may get my student to talk me through what SOHCAHTOA means at a very basic level. I could even get them to actually explain a full question to me and stand up and present it to me. These are just a variety of ways to assess the level, and it should be encouraging that it's not just exam papers here. There are a huge variety of ways that you can assess whether a student understands. You can assess whether a student is confident. With the teaching the teacher, if they can articulate their points and explain things effectively, you should be confident that their understanding is very good. To be able to explain your reasoning thoroughly to another person shows a lot more understanding than just answering a question in silence. Moving on. Accessing previous assessments. This is sort of a 3-step process. 1, you want to contact the school. Of course, you need to obtain the parental consent for this first. But typically, I will ask a student's parent in their first meeting if they're happy for me to contact the school. And if they are, I will ask them to try and get the email address of that particular teacher, for example, the maths teacher. I'll communicate with the teacher, let them know that I'll be the particular student's tutor. And then I'll ask, is there anything in particular we should be working on? Have you got sort of the next few weeks of work lined up? What topics are you covering throughout October? What can I cover? What would be helpful? And then ask for materials, ask for past papers, any in-class assessments for your student, any report cards. It's really useful to get all the collaborators involved, really get the perspective of the teacher as well as just the parent and the student themselves. Now, if you need any help with this, do contact us, as I said, at office@greenhouselearning.co.uk. Finally, I want to stress the importance of recording and tracking assessments. Record the results of every assessment you do, even if it's just a little mark out of 10. It keeps track of what you've covered, keeps track of how the student is progressing, it keeps track of how well the student understands the topic. I personally use spreadsheets for this. I'm a bit of a spreadsheet nerd, and I will keep track of the ratings that I've given them for confidence, for method, and for understanding. In my understanding column, I'll just give them a mark out of 10 if it was a 10-mark worksheet. In the confidence and method, this is something I assess myself. I determine how confident the student is based on their approach, and I assess their method by reading their results and their exam papers or answers to questions. Finally, use your session reports. There's no harm in downloading the session reports that you write to keep track of how the student's doing. If you assess a student in a lesson and they record 8 out of 10 on a trigonometry test, write down in your session report that you did a trigonometry test and the student scored 8 out of 10. It's just the most simple and effective way of keeping track of your assessments, but also keeping the parent in the loop.